It was supposed to be a routine day in the packed courtroom of Judge Alana Cooper, the youngest and first black female judge to serve in the state's history. Her reputation for fairness and unshakable composure made her courtroom a symbol of justice. But on this particular morning, as the gavel echoed across the room to bring order, nobody anticipated that the very system meant to protect and serve would bring chaos. Officer Darren Mason, a white police officer known for his aggressive approach to law enforcement, stood at the witness stand. He was there to testify in a high-profile case involving excessive force during a traffic stop, a case that had already drawn significant media attention. Alana was ready to preside with her usual sharp wit and professionalism. As she read aloud the opening motions, Officer Mason's demeanor shifted. His narrowed eyes and clenched fists radiated hostility. A subtle tension filled the air, but Alana, accustomed to the weight of her role, continued calmly. Her voice carried authority, yet it was never loud. "Officer Mason," she began, "you are here to provide testimony, not opinion. Stick to the facts." Mason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave her a hard stare, one laced with defiance. The quiet murmurs from the gallery signaled the audience's unease. Alana held his gaze, unwavering. "Do you have an issue following court procedure, Officer Mason?" she asked, her tone steady but pointed. Mason, crossing his arms, sneered. "I just find it hard to take orders from someone like you." He muttered under his breath. The room froze. Everyone heard it, but it wasn't clear who would act first. Judge Alana Cooper set down her gavel, her piercing gaze locking onto Officer Mason like a hawk. The gallery collectively held its breath, waiting to see how the judge would respond. Without raising her voice, she asked, "Someone like me, would you care to elaborate, Officer Mason?" The officer smirked, as if daring her to push further. "You know exactly what I mean," he said, his words dripping with venom. "This courtroom is a joke, run by people who don't belong in positions like yours." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, but Alana remained composed. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but sharp as a blade. "Officer Mason, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. Choose your next words carefully." But Mason didn't care. Emboldened by years of unchecked arrogance, he scoffed. "You can't scare me. I've dealt with worse than." He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air, his bigotry laid bare for all to see. Alana straightened in her chair, her robe billowing slightly as she adjusted herself. "Let the record show," she said clearly, her voice carrying authority, "that Officer Mason's comments reflect blatant disregard for this court and its processes. I will not tolerate racism or disrespect in this courtroom." At that moment, Mason's smirk faltered. The gallery whispered in hushed tones. A few of the other officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. But Mason's pride refused to let him back down. "Save your speeches, Your Honor." Mason spat, sarcasm dripping from the last two words. "I'm not here for a lecture." Before Alana could respond, Mason's hand twitched toward his hip, where his service weapon rested. "I've had enough of this farce," he said, the rage now boiling over in his tone. And then, in a move so shocking it felt surreal, Mason unholstered his gun and pointed it directly at Judge Cooper. The room erupted in chaos. Screams echoed through the chamber as people dove under benches and ducked for cover. Security personnel scrambled, but Mason barked, "Nobody move." His hand trembled slightly as the weapon remained fixed on the judge. Judge Cooper, however, didn't flinch. She remained seated, her gaze locked on Mason, as calm as a still lake before a storm. "Officer Mason," she said in a voice that cut through the panic like a knife, "put the weapon down right now." But Mason didn't lower the gun. His breathing was erratic, his rage fully unmasked. "You don't get to order me around," he bellowed. "Not you, not someone like you." Alana didn't move an inch, her calm presence an anchor in the storm of chaos around her. "You are pointing a gun at a judge in a courtroom filled with witnesses," she said evenly. "Think very carefully about what you're doing." The gallery fell silent, every eye on the unfolding standoff. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, broken only by the sound of Officer Mason's labored breathing. His hand gripped the gun tightly, the barrel still trained on Judge Cooper. The security officers stationed near the exits had their hands on their holstered weapons, but they hesitated to act, unsure if a sudden move might escalate the situation. Judge Alana Cooper remained the picture of composure, her unwavering gaze fixed on Mason. "Officer Mason," she said firmly, her voice low but steady enough to carry across the room, "you are committing a felony. Think about the consequences of your actions. Is this really the legacy you want to leave behind?" Mason's hand shook slightly, the weight of her words gnawing at his resolve, but his pride and anger had him in a stranglehold. "You don't get it, do you?" he hissed, his voice breaking. "People like you don't belong here. You've got no business sitting on that bench handing down judgments." Alana's eyes narrowed, her expression sharpening into one of unshakable authority. "And yet, here I am," she said, her tone unwavering. "I earned this seat through hard work, integrity, and justice, values you seem to have forgotten." The gallery remained frozen, some spectators peeking nervously from their hiding spots under benches. Even Mason's fellow officers stood in stunned silence, their faces pale with disbelief. It was clear that this moment wasn't just about a heated argument, it was about exposing the rot festering beneath the surface. "Officer Mason," Alana continued, her voice commanding attention, "this isn't about me or my position. This is about your choices. Right now, you're standing at the edge of a cliff. Step back before it's too late." Mason's jaw clenched, the veins in his neck bulging. "Don't try to lecture me," he spat. "I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know how the world works." "And yet here you are," Alana countered, her calm demeanor cutting through his rage like a scalpel. "Pointing a gun at a judge in a court of law. Is this the world you claim to understand?" Mason hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering. His eyes darted around the room, as if suddenly realizing the sheer number of witnesses. Phones were out, cameras were rolling, capturing every second of his meltdown. "You think you're untouchable," Mason said, his voice shaking now. "But you're just." He stopped himself, the vile words he wanted to say hanging in the air unspoken. He was unraveling, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the moment. Alana seized the opportunity. "Officer Mason," she said, leaning forward ever so slightly, her voice now soft but razor sharp. "This is your final chance. Put the gun down, surrender your weapon, and let's end this before you destroy your life completely." The room held its breath, waiting for Mason's next move. The tension was suffocating, every second dragging like an eternity. Mason's hand trembled visibly now, his rage warring with the creeping realization that he was moments away from irreparably ruining his life. Judge Cooper remained steady, a pillar of strength and calm amidst the storm. "The decision is yours, Officer Mason," she said. "But know this, justice will prevail, with or without your cooperation." For what felt like an eternity, Officer Mason stood frozen, the gun still aimed at Judge Cooper. His hand trembled as beads of sweat formed on his forehead, the weight of every eye in the courtroom, every camera lens pointed at him, and every word spoken by the unshaken judge bore down on him. His once mighty bravado was crumbling under the spotlight of his actions. Judge Alana Cooper never wavered, her calm and steady demeanor a stark contrast to Mason's visible unraveling. "This isn't who you want to be remembered as," she said softly, but with an undeniable authority. "You're not just endangering me, Officer Mason, you're betraying everything you've sworn to uphold." The words hit him like a sledgehammer, and his face betrayed a flicker of doubt. Mason's eyes darted around the room, taking in the stunned expressions of his peers, the officers in the back shifting uncomfortably, and the quiet resolve in the faces of the spectators. His gaze finally landed on a young black boy huddled under one of the benches, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. It was as if a mirror had been held up to Mason in that moment. The image of the boy, cowering in fear, struck a nerve he hadn't known he had. For the first time, he hesitated not because of the consequences awaiting him, but because of the irreversible damage he was causing. Was this how he wanted to be seen, as the face of terror? "Officer Mason," Judge Cooper said again, her voice slicing through his internal chaos, "put the weapon down, and let's handle this the way justice demands. Show these people that you can take accountability for your actions. It's not too late." Her words were simple, but their power lay in the quiet strength behind them. She wasn't shouting, wasn't begging, and certainly wasn't afraid. She was reminding him of something he had long forgotten, what justice truly meant. Mason's grip on the gun faltered further. His hand shook violently now, and his breathing became ragged. The gallery watched with bated breath as he seemed to teeter on the edge of making a life-altering decision. One of the security guards near the it took a cautious step forward, hand hovering near his weapon. "Officer Mason," the guard said cautiously, "listen to the judge. It's time to end this." Mason's head snapped toward the guard, his anger reigniting momentarily. "Don't tell me what to do," he barked, but the outburst lacked its former power. It was a desperate gasp rather than a roar. His own authority, the very thing he had clung to, was slipping away in real time. Judge Cooper seized the moment again, leaning forward slightly. "No one is against you, Officer Mason," she said, her tone firm but understanding. "But right now, you are making a choice that will define the rest of your life. Do you want to be the man who brought shame to his badge, or the man who took responsibility and made things right?" The room was silent again, the weight of her words sinking deep into Mason's crumbling facade. His hand trembled so violently now that the gun began to lower, almost involuntarily. His breathing hitched, and his face twisted into something unrecognizable, an amalgam of rage, fear, and regret. Finally, with a shaky exhale, he dropped the gun to the floor. It clattered loudly against the polished wood, the sound reverberating throughout the courtroom like a bell signaling the end of chaos. Gasps of relief and muted sobs erupted from the gallery as Mason collapsed to his knees. His head hung low. Judge Cooper didn't react with triumph or gloating. Instead, she reached for her gavel, her face as composed as it had been throughout the ordeal. With a sharp rap, she declared, "Officer Mason, you are now in custody for threatening a judicial officer and disrupting the court of law." The security guards rushed forward, restraining Mason and removing him from the room. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as he was led out in handcuffs. He didn't resist, didn't speak. He seemed to know the full weight of what he had done. The gallery erupted in murmurs, the shock of the event slowly giving way to relief. Judge Cooper sat silently for a moment. Gathering herself before addressing the room, "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice as resolute as ever. "Justice does not falter, no matter the challenges it faces." And just like that, she resumed the trial as though nothing had happened, her strength and resolve leaving the room in awe. The courtroom was still reeling from the aftermath of the standoff. Judge Cooper resumed the trial proceedings with remarkable poise, but the tension in the air was palpable. The spectators couldn't stop whispering to one another, their eyes darting to where Officer Mason had stood only minutes earlier. The stark reality of what they had just witnessed lingered, like the remnants of a storm. Despite the judge's calm demeanor, the courtroom staff could see the faint tremor in her hands as she turned the pages of the case file. It was a fleeting moment of vulnerability, quickly masked by her unshakable professionalism. "Let's proceed," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the room. As the trial continued, the news of the incident spread like wildfire. Reporters scrambled outside the courthouse, microphones in hand, eager to catch any updates. Mason's actions had already been captured by numerous phones in the gallery, and clips of him pointing a gun at Judge Cooper were circulating on social media within minutes. Back inside the courtroom, the remaining officers in attendance exchanged uneasy glances. Among them was Lieutenant Carla Davis, a black female officer who had worked tirelessly to reform the department from within. Carla had long known about Mason's tendencies, his offhanded racist remarks, his excessive force complaints, his dismissive attitude toward anyone who didn't look like him. She had filed multiple internal complaints against him, but they always seemed to disappear before reaching the top brass. As the trial concluded for the day, Judge Cooper adjourned the court and rose from her seat. Her gaze swept over the room one last time, landing briefly on Carla. It was a fleeting look, but one that carried unspoken understanding. Hours later, the courthouse was nearly empty, save for the media swarming outside. Inside her chambers, Alana sat at her desk, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, her hands resting on the mahogany desk, and stared at the framed photo of her father, a civil rights activist who had fought for equality during the 20th century. His words echoed in her mind, "The fight for justice isn't easy, but it's necessary." A knock at her door broke her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Davis. "Your Honor," Carla said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to check on you, that was intense." Alana gave a small smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant, I'm fine." "How is the rest of the courthouse staff?" "They're shaken, but everyone's safe," Carla replied, closing the door behind her. She hesitated before speaking again. "Your Honor, I need to say something. Officer Mason's behavior today wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern." Alana leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on." Carla stepped closer, her tone resolute. "Mason has a long history of misconduct. I've filed complaints, but they've been buried. Today, he didn't just lose control, he showed us who he truly is. And if the department doesn't take this seriously now, it never will." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Lieutenant. I'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Meanwhile, at the police precinct, Mason sat in a holding cell, his head in his hands. His career, his reputation, his life, all of it was crumbling. For the first time, the weight of his actions seemed to dawn on him. He wasn't just facing criminal charges. He was about to become the poster child for the consequences of unchecked bias and corruption in law enforcement. The department's Internal Affairs Division was already investigating, and the media pressure was mounting. News anchors dissected the incident in real time, the video clips playing on a loop. Public outrage was immediate, with calls for accountability and justice echoing across the nation. The following morning, Judge Cooper walked into the courtroom once again, her head held high. Protesters had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No one is above the law." She paused briefly, taking in the scene, before stepping inside. As she took her seat, the courtroom fell silent. Today's proceedings were not about a case today. It was about addressing what had occurred the day before. Mason's actions had shaken the community, but they also provided an opportunity for much-needed change. Judge Cooper was determined to use this moment to shine a light on systemic failures and push for accountability. The hearing began. Mason's charges were read aloud, his once defiant demeanor now replaced with a hollow stare. The courtroom was packed with spectators, media, and community leaders. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Officer Darren Mason, now seated at the defendant's table, looked nothing like the cocky, defiant man who had drawn a gun in the very same room less than 24 hours ago. His uniform was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that symbolized his fall from grace. His head hung low, his hands fidgeting nervously as the judge entered the room. Judge Alana Cooper took her seat at the bench, her presence commanding instant silence. Her robes flowed behind her like a banner of justice as she adjusted her glasses and surveyed the room. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her, but she carried it with the same dignity and strength she had shown the day before. "This court is now in session," she declared, her voice firm but measured. "Today's proceedings are to address the actions of former Officer Darren Mason and determine the appropriate consequences for his behavior." The courtroom remained silent, save for the quiet scratching of pens from the reporters in the gallery. The tension was palpable, the entire room hanging on every word. Judge Cooper took a moment to glance at the crowd. Among the attendees were community leaders, fellow officers, and everyday citizens who had come to witness justice in action. Turning her attention to Mason, she spoke. "Mr. Mason, you stand accused of multiple charges, including brandishing a firearm in a court of law, threatening a judicial officer, and disrupting legal proceedings. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting nervously around the room. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he shook his head. After a long pause, he finally looked up at Judge Cooper. His voice was low, almost inaudible. I made a mistake," he stammered. "I lost my temper. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Judge Cooper's expression didn't change. "A mistake," she echoed, her voice steady but with an edge of steel. "Mr. Mason, pointing a loaded weapon at a judge in open court isn't a mistake. It's a deliberate, dangerous action that could have had catastrophic consequences." Mason's lawyer tried to interject. "Your Honor, my client has already expressed remorse." "Remorse doesn't erase the harm caused." Judge Cooper cut in, her tone sharp. "This isn't just about your client's actions, counselor. This is about the trust he violated, not only in this courtroom, but in the community he swore to serve and protect." The courtroom murmured in agreement. The sound quickly hushed as the judge raised her hand. She turned her attention back to Mason, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Mason, your actions yesterday weren't just an attack on me as an individual. They were an attack on the very principles of justice and equality. You allowed your prejudice and anger to cloud your judgment, putting countless lives at risk in the process." Mason's face flushed red, but he remained silent. The weight of her words seemed to crush whatever remained of his defiance. Judge Cooper continued. "The actions of one officer don't define an entire system, but they do expose its flaws. This court cannot and will not ignore the systemic failures that allowed you to believe your behavior was acceptable. It's not just you who must be held accountable, Mr. Mason. It's the culture that enabled you." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Judge Cooper's words hit like a thunderclap. She wasn't just addressing Mason, she was addressing the system itself. The officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement while others avoided her gaze. "Therefore," she said, her voice unwavering, "this court is recommending that you face the maximum penalty for your actions, not only to hold you accountable, but to send a clear message. No one is above the law." Mason's lawyer stood, ready to object, but Judge Cooper silenced him with a single raised hand. "Furthermore," she added, "this court will also recommend a full investigation into the complaints against Mr. Mason and any officers or administrators who failed to act on them. Accountability doesn't stop with the individual, it extends to the system." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the gravity of her statement sinking in. Reporters scribbled furiously, their faces lit with the realization that this case was about to become a landmark moment in addressing systemic injustice. As Mason was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the murmurs grew louder. Judge Cooper sat silently for a moment, allowing the weight of what had just transpired to settle over the room. Finally, she looked out at the crowd, her voice carrying a message that reverberated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. "Justice isn't perfect, but it must be unwavering. It doesn't bow to prejudice, power, or fear. It is blind, but it is not silent. Let this be a reminder that accountability starts here and now." The gavel struck, and the courtroom rose in quiet reverence. Justice had spoken. As the gavel's echo faded, the courtroom began to empty, but the impact of the proceedings lingered like a heavy fog. Reporters swarmed the hallways, microphones thrust into the faces of attorneys, officers, and anyone willing to speak about the explosive case. The footage of Mason pointing his gun at Judge Cooper was already plastered across every major news network, sparking a national conversation about racism, abuse of power, and systemic reform in law enforcement. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of protesters and supporters had gathered, holding signs with messages like "Justice for All" and "Hold Police Accountable." The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anger and hope, as people of all backgrounds came together to demand change. Judge Cooper stepped out of the courthouse later that evening, her security detail flanking her. As she descended the steps, the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. She paused, surprised by the outpouring of support, and raised her hand in a quiet gesture of acknowledgement. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions, but Alana remained composed. "Judge Cooper, do you have any comments on today's events?" one reporter called out. Alana stopped, her calm yet commanding presence silencing the chaos. She looked directly at the cameras, her voice steady. Today wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about reaffirming that justice must apply to everyone, equally and without prejudice. There is still much work to be done, but moments like these remind us that the fight for fairness is never in vain. The crowd erupted in cheers once again as Alana made her way to her car. She was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The work was far from over. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, the ripple effects of Mason's actions were being felt deeply. Lieutenant Carla Davis sat in the conference room with the chief of police reviewing Mason's personnel file. It was a damning document filled with complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional conduct, all of which had been buried or dismissed by his superiors. "This should have been addressed years ago," Carla said, slamming the folder shut. "How many more officers like Mason are we protecting by ignoring these patterns?" The chief sighed, his face heavy with regret. "You're right," he admitted. "This department has failed, and yesterday's incident exposed just how deep the cracks go. It's time for change." The chief announced an immediate review of all pending complaints against officers, along with mandatory bias training and a public apology to Judge Cooper and the community. The announcement, while long overdue, was seen as a small step toward rebuilding trust. That night, Alana sat in her modest home, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and notes. She sipped a cup of chamomile tea, her thoughts racing despite the quiet of her surroundings. The day had been one of the most challenging of her career, but also one of the most meaningful. Her father's words echoed in her mind once again. The fight for justice isn't easy, but it's necessary. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Carla Davis. "Thank you for your strength today. It meant more than you know. Together we'll keep pushing for change." Alana smiled softly, her resolve strengthening. She replied simply, "Thank you, Lieutenant, one step at a time." As she set her phone down, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was long, but today had shown her and the world that progress was possible. In the days that followed, the fallout from the incident continued to unfold. Mason's arrest became a rallying point for activists and reformers, sparking protests and demands for better oversight in police departments nationwide. His trial was set to be a high-profile case, with Judge Cooper recusing herself to ensure impartiality. The video of the courtroom standoff became a symbol of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed, but it also highlighted the power of resilience and justice. Judge Cooper's calm, unwavering response in the face of danger inspired countless people, reminding them that true strength lies not in force, but in integrity. As the nation debated, protested, and pushed for change, one thing was clear. The incident in Judge Cooper's courtroom was more than just a moment. It was a movement. The day of Darren Mason's trial arrived, and the courtroom was once again packed with reporters, community leaders, and spectators eager to witness the next chapter of the case that had gripped the nation. Unlike the defiance he displayed during his initial outburst, Mason now appeared hollow, a shadow of the man he once was. His eyes were sunken, and the arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by resignation. The prosecution laid out a damning case, presenting not only the video evidence from the courtroom, but also a detailed record of Mason's history within the police department. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and harassment painted a clear picture of a man who had abused his authority for years, shielded by a system unwilling to hold him accountable. Each piece of evidence was like another nail in the coffin of his career and reputation. Witnesses were called to testify, including Lieutenant Carla Davis. She spoke with conviction about the systemic failures within the department, her voice unwavering as she described the culture of silence that had protected officers like Mason. What happened in that courtroom was the result of years of unchecked misconduct. She said, "If we don't address this, it will happen again." The most powerful testimony, however, came from Judge Alana Cooper herself. Having recused herself from overseeing the trial, she now took the stand as a witness, dressed in her judicial robes. She spoke with the same calm authority that had defined her response during the standoff. "Mason's actions were not just a threat to me personally," she said, her voice echoing through the silent room. "They were a threat to the integrity of our justice system. No one is above the law, and no one is exempt from accountability, not even those who wear a badge." Her words reverberated far beyond the courtroom walls, becoming a rallying cry for justice and reform. Clips of her testimony spread across social media, inspiring conversations about systemic racism, police accountability, and the importance of judicial impartiality. In the weeks following the trial, Mason was found guilty on multiple charges, including threatening a judicial officer and reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, his once prominent career reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and prejudice. But the story didn't end there. Judge Cooper's actions had ignited a nationwide movement. Police departments across the country began implementing reforms, from mandatory bias training to stronger oversight of misconduct complaints. Community leaders and activists used Mason's case as a platform to push for broader changes, demanding transparency and accountability from law enforcement. Lieutenant Carla Davis became a prominent figure in the fight for reform, using her position within the department to advocate for change from the inside. Her persistence paid off as new policies were enacted to ensure that officers like Mason could no longer hide behind bureaucratic protections. As for Judge Alana Cooper, her life changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She became a symbol of courage and integrity, her face appearing on magazine covers and her story featured in national headlines. But she remained grounded, continuing to serve in her courtroom with the same dedication and fairness that had defined her career. One evening, months after the incident, she was invited to speak at a community event. The room was filled with people from all walks of life, students, activists, officers, and everyday citizens who had been inspired by her actions. As she stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Standing at the podium, Alana took a moment to gather her thoughts. "What happened in my courtroom was a moment of reckoning," she began, her voice steady. "But reckoning alone is not enough. True justice requires action from all of us. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's necessary." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Change starts when we refuse to accept the status quo, when we demand better, when we hold ourselves and each other accountable. Together, we can build a system that serves everyone equally and fairly. The crowd erupted into cheers, her words igniting a fire in the hearts of everyone present. Alana stepped back from the podium, her heart full as she watched the people around her unite in a shared vision of justice and equality. As she left the stage, she couldn't help but think of her father's words once more. The fight for justice isn't easy, but it's necessary. And she knew that while the fight was far from over, every step forward was worth it.